I'm Sam Zakharoff. I'm a professor here at NYU, and this is our forum on the upcoming election. Obviously, we're only 2 weeks out from Election Day. We are struggling through a pandemic. We are struggling through deeply contested legal issues in hundreds, if not thousands, of cases around the country, including a decision by the Supreme Court last night. And to discuss all these various issues, we have a wonderful panel. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak initially. First, we have Ben Ginsberg, who is a recently retired partner from Jones Day. Ben has been one of the leading Republican strategists and counselors on election matters, going back, I think, to Indiana in 1984, maybe even back before that. He was also, together with Bob Bauer, who teaches here at NYU, part of the Bauer-Ginsberg bipartisan commission that was set up to look at voting reforms in anticipation of difficult elections such as this one, reforms that have not fully seen the light of day, to be modest about that. We have Franita Tolson from the University of Southern California. Franita's Twitter account lists her, if I have this right, as the commander of obscure constitutional provisions. And I have been on many programs with Franita over the years, and I'm always amazed at what convoluted, interesting, and yet, I have to confess, a little bizarre constitutional claims she's able to articulate. I'm hopeful that that will continue today. And then finally, Rick Pildes doesn't need introduction. He's obviously a professor here at NYU. He's teaching the law of democracy this semester and has been lawyer, counselor, commentator, media presence on these issues for years. And so we hope to get this going in a way that's illuminating. Obviously, there's a temptation just to look at the events of the day, but let's step back a little bit. Ben, if I can ask you the first question, with the benefit of experience, perhaps what's your take on this election in the sense that it feels more existential? It feels like everything's at stake. Rick was just quoting Michael Steele as saying that it's America versus Trump. There's usually not that kind of cataclysmic language around American elections. Is this different, or is this basically how people get worked up on the eve of the election every 4 years?
Well, a little bit of both. First of all, thanks for having me, Sam and Rick, to NYU, which is always a pleasure. Sorry we're not there in person. But the 2020 election does feel different, I think, for any number of reasons. First of all, very, very few of us have lived through a national election during a pandemic where we're either socially distanced or in our homes or offices much more. That makes all life different. I think you need to also look at this election because President Trump has put it in a different light. I mean, we've never had a president of the United States say that before the election, without any evidence, that our elections are riddled with fraud and are rigged, and the only way he can lose is to cheat. And that's just a terribly unique framing of this election that casts doubt on some of the basic pillars of the democracy. We're also, as I know the three of you have talked about and written about extensively, a much more polarized country than we were even 4 years ago. So I think all those things combine together to make this very unusual. And of course, we would be remiss in not adding that this is also the election that will determine redistricting for the next decade. And while that's not front of mind to most people, it has a huge impact on what the next decade will be like in the country.
Can I just follow up on that for a second before we go to Fernita? So back in the 1980s, you and Lee Atwater began I think it's fair to say, the Republican focus on state legislatures and the redistricting process and the spillover that would have into national politics. Are you seeing the results of that in renewed attention on the redistricting issue, or is everything just so completely subsumed by the person of the president that everything has sort of died off on the side?
In terms of public notice, I think redistricting has really not front and center in any way, shape, manner, or form. But I think the importance of redistricting is front of mind to a group of party operatives on each side of the aisle. So I think that there is a lot of active redistricting work that's going on that's not getting much public notice. I mean, it sort of feels to me in the 90s, the Republicans were the group that had been out of power for 40 years. And in the 90s, we had all the momentum and enthusiasm for redistricting. I do feel that Republicans have had a 30-year run at really being the dominant force in legislative seats and in governorships. And that feels like it's waning a little bit, and that the Democrats, in terms of redistricting, are better funded, better organized, better dealing with the litigation sort of menu as it comes up.
Fernita, picking up on Ben's last point, there's a number of legal flashpoints in this election, and one of them that's surfacing now, of course, is the role of the state legislatures. So here's your obscure constitutional provisions moment. The fact is that the Republicans control the majority of state legislatures, including in states that are at least likely or reported in the surveys and the polls to be heading toward Biden, and that creates all kinds of legal ambiguity. So what do you consider to be the sort of the flashpoint legal issues at this time?
First, let me thank you and Rick for inviting me. This is a much needed conversation. I'm so excited. So it's one of those questions where do you even start, right? So in terms of legal flashpoints, what we've seen with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic is lots of litigation over the rules governing this upcoming election cycle, but there was also litigation about the primary season. And so in some ways, the primary season was a audition of sorts about the types of things that can be challenged going into the November election. And in recent days, we've seen decisions over drop boxes in Texas. The governor issued a order limiting drop boxes to 1 per county. We've seen litigation about witness signatures. We've seen litigation, as you mentioned, with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court split 4-4 and let that decision stand over the deadline for receipt of absentee ballots. So I do think that a lot of this will start waning in the coming days, but we'll start to see things that are, I think, maybe more alarming in some respects. So, for example, in recent days, the president has called for more poll workers to monitor the polls and such. And I think that call could easily devolve into voter intimidation, because I don't think most voters realize that poll workers are governed to some extent by state law. And, the parties play a role in selecting poll workers in many states. Sometimes they have to go through training. And I fear that we'll have a situation where people just turn out and think that they can oversee the polls, and it can really lead into maybe violent confrontations and voter intimidation in other situations. But there's also the risk, and perhaps this is a risk that exists in regular presidential election years, that when you have so much litigation that's confusing to voters about their rights, they have no idea leading into election day what they can and cannot do in terms of casting an effective ballot. And so I think that's exacerbated more this year. But I want to make a broader point, Sam. Our election infrastructure was already fragile, right? So we've had 2 elections and 5 election cycles in which the winner of the Electoral College lost a popular vote. And that really caused a lot of people to question the basic structure of our system. But that combined with high levels of political polarization, the crumbling election infrastructure more generally, right? The fact that state election processes, they are underfunded. Election administrators don't have enough money to really put the infrastructure in place that they need, as well as increasing efforts to suppress the vote. It kind of makes you wonder if the chickens are just coming home to roost at this point. It's like all of these weaknesses were already there to be exploited. And 2020, in some ways, is just a perfect storm that invites all of these flashpoints to converge in one space at one time. So, you know, I wish I could paint a more optimistic picture, but that would be totally out of line with what 2020 has turned out to be.
Rick, again, picking up on that, there are differences in how the voting is taking place this year, and perhaps you can give some sense of what's the optimistic story on institutional adaptation to questions like the pandemic and so forth, but also what's the legal pushback. And maybe you've been writing a great deal about the stakes in the Pennsylvania dispute. Maybe you could flesh that out a little bit.
Okay, well, I'm thrilled to be here, not at NYU or in my home when I'm at NYU these days, but to be here with you and with Ben and Fernita. So it's of all the panels I've done, this is a particular treat. So yes, let me talk about some of the big picture positives about how the system has changed for the election this fall, because I think we lose track of the sort of big picture in all of the media attention, including, you know, attention we give to these individual court decisions that are coming out day after day after day. So stepping back, if you remember back in the spring and the early summer, the major issue when it became clear the pandemic might still be around this fall was, would states change their policies to permit people to vote by mail, to vote absentee without any particular excuse? Particularly states that had not traditionally permitted that. And as it turns out, 45 states are now permitting any voter who wants to vote by mail to vote by mail. And that was really the biggest policy issue early on when we started facing the virus and the election coming together. And most of that change took place through legislative action or executive action. For the most part, it wasn't forced on us by forced on legislatures by courts. State legislatures, Republican and Democratic, moved to permitting all voters to vote by mail, except in 5 states. The second thing that's also changed in terms of adapting, and many of these changes have been put in place just for this election, not necessarily permanently. States that traditionally do not permit any early voting have shifted to permit early voting. So Kentucky, for example, doesn't normally permit any early voting, but through a bipartisan deal there, they now have 3 weeks of early voting this fall. Same thing with South Carolina. They don't normally have early voting. Now they have a month of early voting. And even in Texas, which has been in the news a lot, including for the Dropbox issue that Fernita mentioned, Texas is one of the 5 states that requires a specific excuse to vote absentee, like being away. But the governor in Texas, through executive order, expanded early voting there by 6 days. He actually did that over the objections of the state Republican Party. So Texas now has 2.5 weeks of early voting. So we have actually dramatically expanded the opportunities for participation in the ways people can participate, given the ongoing concerns with the virus, both through mail-in voting and through expanded early voting. And I think it's important to recognize that, and you see voters taking advantage of that throughout the country right now. Now in terms of ongoing issues, the issue I've been hammering away at unsuccessfully since March is that states vary a lot in how soon they can let their election officials start processing the absentee ballots. And given that they're going to have a much greater volume this year, election officials need and have been begging for more time to start that process. And in many states, they've been given that. So in Florida, a crucial state, they process their absentee ballots starting now, 3 weeks in advance of the election, in fact. But in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, and I really consider Pennsylvania ground zero for where things in this election might collapse into real chaos. Both of those states don't let their election officials to start processing their absentee ballots until election day. And that is inevitably going to mean, with a very high volume of votes cast absentee, that those states, particularly Pennsylvania, are going to be very slow in being able to report complete results. So that is my biggest concern: long delays in getting to knowledge of who's won, which will open up huge fights in the courts and with election officials over absentee ballots. So let me stop there as an initial set of comments.
Well, then let me go to Fernita to get the weird constitutional provision part of this. But I want to frame that a little bit. The Electoral Count Act, which is this rightfully obscure statute that was poorly crafted in the 19th century and hasn't gotten better with time, speaks of something called a failed election. And so there's this concept floating out there that electoral failure is something that has to be remedied by state legislative action, presumably by state legislative action. There are two provisions of the Constitution, one from Article 2, one from Article 1, that were at issue in Pennsylvania. Can you just walk the audience through what was up before the Supreme Court? For the court to split 4-4 on a stay is dramatic, because had they treated it as a cert petition, which they could have taken cert on it with 4 votes. They decided to treat it only as an application for a stay. But what do you think is at issue in the Pennsylvania litigation? Going back to Rick's point that if everything goes wrong in this election, Pennsylvania will likely be ground zero for that.
Yes, so Rick has done a lot of work around this, and interestingly enough, it's scared me probably more than I otherwise would have been. So the issue before the Supreme Court was whether or not the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's decision extending the days in which absentee ballots can be received by to 3 days after Election Day violated the prerogative of the state legislature to make that determination under Article 2, which gives to the state legislature and not any other organ of the state government the power of choosing the manner of appointing electors. And also under the Elections Clause of Article 1, Section 4, state legislatures choose the time, place, and manner of federal elections, subject only to Congress's power to make or alter those regulations. So there's a doctrine called the Independent State Legislature Doctrine, which I would say is an obscure doctrine that I don't support. That state legislatures under this doctrine are not bound by state constitutional provisions, right? So the state Supreme Court in changing the deadline has undermined the state legislature's exclusive authority to exercise their federal function here, i.e. appointing the manner of electors or setting the election day under Article 1, Section 4. So the problem with the independent state legislature doctrine is that state legislatures themselves are creatures of state constitutions. So that would effectively mean that state legislatures can operate in this space when it comes to the rules governing federal elections, independent for the most part of state court interpretations, which is terrifying in some ways. But had the Supreme Court, and in particular the 4 justices who wanted to decide the issue, had they sided with the Pennsylvania Republicans, it would have also placed the decision on a collision course with a U.S. Supreme Court decision that's only about 5 years old, Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission, in which the court held that the word legislature encompassed any process for lawmaking within a state and not just the formal institutional legislature. And so had the court sided with the Pennsylvania Republicans, they would have effectively overruled that case through the shadow docket, which is incredibly unusual and probably really, really rare. But even more pointedly, to get to sort of the obscure point, I have wondered in thinking about the implications of this case under 3 U.S.C. 15, when Congress convenes to count the electors, there's a process where if, let's say, 2 slates of electors are submitted, the process outlined in that statutory scheme requires both houses of Congress to agree on which slate is the proper slate. And if both houses cannot agree, there's a process for the executive of a state to decide which slate is the proper slate, which could be at issue in this election cycle, particularly if Pennsylvania Republicans decide to exercise the nuclear option under 3 U.S.C. 2 and say that it's a failed election and they're going to appoint the slate of electors. So my question is, if the Supreme Court would have sided with Pennsylvania Republicans, does that mean that and endorse this independent state legislature doctrine? Does that mean that 3 U.S.C. 15 is unconstitutional to the extent that it delegates to the executive the power to decide competing slates, right? So for me, the case raised a whole host of issues that I don't even know if the Supreme Court could have possibly anticipated and had they affirmatively weighed in on this question. So 4-4 split is honestly the best possible outcome in this case, in my view.
Ben, let's pick up on that phrase, the nuclear option, because if one reads overly literally, in my view, but certainly plausibly, the text of Article 2 of the Constitution, it leaves the state legislatures an uncabined right or power to appoint a slate of electors in any manner they see fit. Doesn't say when. It doesn't say that the legislature can't say the voters got it wrong and we're substituting this slate. It doesn't have any inherent limitations on it, and certainly there's no case law because it's never been invoked once we're in the modern era where elections are held. And we know that people don't sit around at cocktail parties and say, back in the day, I voted for not Johnson or Nixon or Reagan or whomever, but I voted for John Smith because he was a great elector. This is just not part of our conception of the world. So the question is, how come this is now part of the discourse this year? It was floating in the background in 2000 with all the debates over Florida, but I've never seen it as part of a serious discussion the way it is now and the way it's openly being discussed in the Pennsylvania state legislature. Is this really the nuclear option? And would this not threaten to blow up the entire system here?
Well, I certainly agree that it would threaten to blow up the entire system. I mean, I do think that the fact that we're discussing this so much, it is part of the age of Trump and the polarization and the discord that we've talked about in other areas. I mean, I've never seen an election where so many people from academia have written so many interesting papers on potential scenarios that have really very little chance of ever coming about. In other words, I do think that because the president set the parameters by all of a sudden saying our elections were fraudulent without any evidence, that the ability to kind of blow up the election, to create a nuclear option, is just much more part of the dialogue now. And because of the pandemic and the onslaught of absentee ballots, it's not going to be normal timing, potentially, and much less potentially will be known on election night. So the nuclear options, I think, to me, are sort of a group of people looking at the president and seeing nothing but bad faith. And so therefore, we better go deep on what could happen.
You were quoted, I think you wrote something in Bloomberg, it may have been, where you said that there's less than a 1% chance of a meltdown on election day. That sounds reassuring, except the term meltdown usually implies the core of the reactor goes through the earth and divides it in half and life ends. So there's high risk involved with that. And I just am struck by the commonplace discussion of nuclear options in this election cycle, the way even under the pressure of Florida 2000 and Bush v. Gore and the recount and all that, there was not serious recourse to that. I think that it's partially Trump, but it's also a deep erosion of faith in the institutions of American democracy, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, you started off by asking whether this seems more existential than other elections, and that's true, because where the less than 1% chance of a meltdown occurs is really looking at history, right? Most election nights, you know who the winner is, and if you take into account the fact that we do have an unprecedented number of absentee ballots, and the key states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have expanded deadlines, so things could take longer. There's still an overwhelming chance that we're going to know a clear winner of the election early enough. Now, either 3 or 4 of our elections have gone to contests and recounts. Depends how you want to deal with 1800, when the Electoral College was a totally different animal. So the chances of there even being an outcome determinative state that's close enough for a recount or a contest, it's like either 5% or 7%. So that's why I think that we are going to know a clear winner one way or another, maybe election night, maybe a couple of weeks afterwards. But history would tell you that just the way the numbers work out, forget the existential nature of it, but the numbers work out, so we're going to know a winner.
Rick, that puts a lot of pressure on the ability to vote and the counting of the votes. And, we both teach law of democracy, and at least when I teach it, or taught it in the past, I would say that there's certain phases of the legal intervention into the political process. And the first one was in securing the right to vote. The second was in representation. The third was effectiveness of representation. And I'd say the first one, not complete, but we've basically put that behind us. And as we've discussed many times, now all of a sudden we're spending more and more of our course on just the exercise of the franchise. So Ben draws from history, but the vote itself is more contested this time than at any time in history. And it's not just at any time in recent history. And it's not just assaults on poll work, on polling place voting, in-person voting on election day, but it's potentially challenges to every absentee ballot. It's potentially violence at the counting centers. Are you as optimistic as Ben on how this is all going to play out?
Well, I think my simple answer to that is the obvious one, which is it depends on the margin of victory for the winning candidate. So as Ben says, the odds are we're not going to have an incredibly tight election like we did in 2016 or that we did in 2000 with the Bush v. Gore contest that ended up in the Supreme Court. But if we do have an extremely close election that turns on the outcome in 3 or 4 states, I do think the situation is as explosive as any in my lifetime for an election. Ben has alluded to some of the reasons. Just to put some numbers on this, in terms of how many people view this election as existential, meaning, at least in my view, that the country will not be the same if the other side wins. It's just an irreversible change for a terrible path that we're going to go down. So 85% of people say this election, it really matters who wins. And only 16% say things are going to be pretty much the same regardless of who wins. That's the highest it's ever been. And if you go back to 2000 in Bush v. Gore, at the time of that election, 50% of people said it really mattered who won. 44% of people said things would be the same no matter who wins. That's number one. Number two, both sides are primed to believe the election is stolen if it doesn't come out the way they want. Ben mentioned this, but again, let's put some numbers on this. 65% of Biden supporters believe Trump will cheat to win. 51% of Trump supporters believe Biden will cheat to win. 25% of people on each side say today already that the only way their candidate can lose is if the election is rigged. And it's not just President Trump who said this. Joe Biden did say a week or so ago the same thing. The only way I can lose is if the election is rigged. Now, he was pushed to retract that, and he did retract it, but it tells you kind of where we are. We haven't talked about social media. Put that into the mix here. If we have significant delays in knowing who's won the election, social media is going to explode with misinformation or spins on maybe accurate information, sinister stories about partisan manipulation behind the scenes. And then next thing to keep in mind that's so different from in the past, we don't really have institutions now that are broadly trusted as being capable of providing relatively impartial mechanisms for resolving any disputes that might arise. The courts have been swept up into the polarization of our culture and are now much more perceived in partisan terms, whether rightly or wrongly, by many voters. And then the final thing here, which I wouldn't underplay, is the risk of violence is something I've never seen in American elections in my lifetime. And again, I'll give you some numbers, and I find these stunning. 44% of Republicans, 41% of Democrats on September 1st said there's at least a justification for at least a little violence if the other side wins. And those numbers have been going up every month as we get closer to the election. So, this is potentially a very explosive and dangerous situation if the election is close. If we don't know for 3 or 4 days who's won, I think that's dangerous. The odds are we won't be in that position. But if we do end up in that position, I certainly think there's good reason to be concerned about how the country will process that situation and the kind of turmoil that might result.
So, Fernita, what are the institutional mechanisms of repair at this point? It used to be that much was determined by the political parties and the party elders. At some point, the party elders told Al Gore, stand down. At some point, the party elders told Richard Nixon in 1960 to stand down, both in deeply contested elections with some miscarrying out of the electoral mission in both cases. Where is that institutional background? Where are there's not the political parties, there's no Walter Cronkite. Where are we, where do we look to for that?
That's a tough question, Sam, because I don't, those usual mechanisms aren't going to hold anymore, right? We have had a pretty sustained period where our institutions have been under attack, both the media as a whole, as well as our traditional sort of, as you pointed to, the political party infrastructure, who under normal circumstances would tell President Trump to watch his language or watch his rhetoric. You don't really have that. And so I do wonder if this is part of the broader narrative of people taking to the streets, right? So a lot of it, of recent protests were motivated by Black Lives Matters and the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. But it wasn't like this was the first round of protests. When President Trump was first elected, there were protests across the country. And I wonder if some of that is also a response to our breakdown in institutions, where people are resorting to traditional patterns of protest in the government in order to get their voices heard. And I do think it also ties into a broader disconnect where for a number of years, there have been significant voter suppression efforts. And so you can't try to suppress the vote of individuals and then tell them to vote in order to change things, right? And so people are going to look for other avenues in order to try to force political change. That being said, I do think that, as Rick pointed to earlier in the conversation, there are some glimmers of hope, right? So state courts have been good on some of these issues, which suggests that the courts, we shouldn't sort of paint all of the courts with a broad brush, to the extent that one is disenchanted with the US Supreme Court, as I am. There are some avenues for change there. There's also ballot initiatives. So some states have had ballot initiatives recently where they've tried to tackle issues like partisan gerrymandering and other things that have made change difficult. So I think perhaps this is one upside of this moment, right? It has forced people, everyday people, to try to look for other ways of effectuating political change because of the breakdown of our institutions and the traditional ways in which we police these things.
Sam, what's your answer to that question?
My answer was I was going to recount a conversation that you and I had over dinner in late 2012. And so in 2012, Ben was running the Romney campaign. I don't remember your exact title, but
I was just the lawyer.
Yeah, you were just the lawyer. Okay, yeah. We've heard many stories over the years, but okay, you're sticking with that one. And I was working on the Obama campaign, and we had dinner, and I said that the thing that surprised me in the Obama campaign in 2012, even with the advantage of incumbency, was that it was run as a presidential campaign exclusively. It didn't seem to have anything called state political parties as backstops. They just weren't important. They didn't provide the legal resources. They didn't provide many of the political resources. It seemed to be top-down presidential campaign. And you said that it was effectively the same thing on the Republican side, that you were running a presidential campaign because the state level institutions were so weak. And so what that conversation, which I've published, Ben, with your permission in some fashion, is indicative that the way that we channel political activity by integrating people into institutions is largely failing. And it's failing at the level of how they get their information. That's the media versus social media point. It's failing at the level of how they participate, which is Franita's point, which is they feel that they don't have an avenue through political parties. I think that there was hope in the Democratic Party this year because of this extraordinary rallying around Biden. Remember, Biden came into Super Tuesday. He had no money. He had little organization, and it seemed like the party was going to implode. And there was really, I found it extraordinary and unexpected, the ability of the voters to and the other candidates to draw around him. But it's very hard especially on the Republican side, where the party has been so completely dominated by the person of Donald Trump. And we know that he's going to be inflammatory after Election Day, particularly if he's behind. I don't see the mechanism for participation. And that gives rise, as Rick said, to the prospect of violence for the first time. You know, you go to other countries, you go to India, and every election in India results in hundreds, if not thousands, of people dead from violence. And that has not been the recent experience in the United States. So I am very pessimistic on this score, precisely because I don't see the institutional framework. But let me turn that back to you. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if we do end up in that very existential place, the answer will have to be from Republican congressional leadership going to Trump. I mean, there is, I take your characterization of the Republican leadership as essentially being subsumed to Trump, but that's done with considerable personal resentment. So there is sort of a boiling cauldron there that I think if the health of the nation depended on it would probably rise up. But I mean, that assumes that Trump is behind in vote totals as opposed to ahead narrowly. And if he's ahead narrowly, then they're going to keep rooting on for him. But if he's behind and being obstructionist about accepting defeat, then I think that there is a sleeping giant there to be awoken.
Yeah, Rick Hasen has coined a phrase which I've taken to heart about elections being beyond the margin of litigation. And that is that there's enough of a separation that nobody is tempted to go to court. And that's how we've avoided a lot of problems. But there's also now elections beyond the margin of political manipulation, if you will. That is that it's decisive enough, early enough that that the attempt to rally around the candidate, no matter what, will drop out on either side of the divide.
There is some Trump exhaustion that plays into this too.
Rick, you look like.
Oh, well, you know, I think one thing we should mention here is that, and this is again, the sort of the optimistic perspective, we may effectively know who's won the election, even on election night, late election night, or in the early hours of the next morning, even if the networks, for example, can't declare an actual winner. And the reason for that is that there are some states that are important states that are likely to get to a pretty complete count either on election night or early the next morning. And so Florida is number one on this list. And Florida is obviously a state by all assessments that President Trump has to win to have any path to the White House, to return to the White House. North Carolina is also a state that may be able to get to a fairly complete count relatively early. So even if we don't know who's won Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin for a couple of days, and so we can't formally be told there is a winner who's gotten 270 electoral votes, we may effectively know even late on election night, because, for example, if Joe Biden wins Florida, the election is basically over for all practical purposes. The second thing the networks are going to do, or I say networks, that shows how old I am, but the cable and network broadcast stations will do, is they're going to have complete counts from at least some counties, even in states that cannot complete their counts statewide. And they're going to give information about how President Trump is doing relative to how he did in 2016. And if he's systematically right in the same ballpark as he was in 2016, that's a pretty strong signal this is going to be a very close election. But if he's significantly falling off or moving ahead of the baseline from 2016 in a number of these counties in different parts of the country, that will also be a very strong signal about where the election is going. You know, in terms of institutions that might provide the kind of stability and legitimacy that we desperately will need if we get into a contested election situation, I think the only hope really is if the courts, when they get involved, are able to generate kind of close to unanimous opinions. That could provide some mechanism that would lead to fairly broad legitimacy to the outcome. You know, if the Supreme Court has to get involved, which I assume is not likely, there's a big difference between an 8-0 decision and a 5-3 decision that could affect the election outcome. And similarly with state courts. But, you know, we are in a bad place. We have spent so much time attacking our institutions, attacking authority, not trusting any of these processes, social media presenting the most extreme polarized pictures of what's going on with our institutions, that when you need them most, it's unclear whether they'll be able to perform the social role that is so important for generating acceptance of outcomes. And as you say, nothing is more potentially destabilizing to democratic systems than a contested election for the top executive official that leads to confrontations in the street. I mean, we've seen that over and over again in other democracies. It's an incredibly vulnerable moment for democracies. We have not had to deal with that since 1876 in the United States, when we came very close to that situation of a civil war over a disputed presidential election. You know, as I say, the background circumstances this time do give, I think, me at least, you know, tremendous concerns about what will happen if we do get into that situation.
Sam, it may be worth making the political point for what states on election night, just to fill out what Rick was saying, what states on election night will be driving the way we see the election and how close its results are.
Great.
So Florida is absolutely correct. North Carolina is absolutely correct. They get their results out early. Georgia gets its results historically out even earlier, and it's an important state to look at. And Ohio is usually pretty good. And they're all states that Donald Trump has to win, and if Joe Biden's winning them, he's going to be the president easily. The 3 states that Hillary Clinton won narrowly, that if Donald Trump is winning, is a pretty good sign he's going to get a second term, are New Hampshire and Minnesota and Nevada, all of which are, Nevada being in the Western time zone, pretty good states. Then there'll be
Good, you mean in terms of getting the results processed?
getting the results, right, and getting pretty completes done on election night. And then there are parts of 3 other states that will be important. Maricopa County, Arizona, does a very good job of getting their absentee ballot counts out. It's 60% of Arizona, which is a very key state. People will look to the suburban counties around Milwaukee, the WOW counties, where Donald Trump has to make up a lot of his margin in the state, and how he's doing compared to 2016 will be a real tell. And then Pennsylvania, although Pennsylvania itself will be very late in getting its absentees out for the reasons Rick said, the T portion of Pennsylvania, running up the middle of the state and then branching out to the east and the west, is Donald Trump territory. It's where he needs to make up for Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And because he's engaged in this strategy, as ill-advised as it seems, to tell his people to vote in person and not trust the mails, there will be comparisons to how he was doing in 2016 that will provide a tell on Pennsylvania, especially as long as Pennsylvania officials can tell you how many absentee ballots are still outstanding potentially. So I think the reporting from those areas, and maybe a few others, but those areas are going to be the key to the way people deal on Wednesday and Thursday with how close the election is.
So what extent does the blue shift affect our sense of knowing the outcome?
Well, it affects 2 states, really. I mean, the 2 states where there would have to be a blue wave to wipe away the red haze of more Trump votes on election day are really Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. All other states, even now Michigan, can begin to process their absentee ballots beforehand. So most of them should be included in the election night counts. So I think that phenomenon is now limited to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, with maybe North Carolina, where there are competing court cases on whether there's an absentee ballot deadline extension.
Let me also add one small point that also suggests that some of these nightmare scenarios may not prove out to actually occur. As we've gotten closer to the election, the percentage of people who are now saying they're going to vote in person, early voting, or on election day has been going up. And so the numbers that I've seen lately now suggest that maybe about 29%, 29% of the country will be voting by absentee. And North Carolina, for example, I just saw data that suggests 27% of people are going to be voting by mail there. Now, that's a very different world than one in which 40% or 50% of the ballots are cast absentee. And I consider this a very heartening piece of information. I have been arguing for many months that the best thing people can do to reduce the risks of an election meltdown is to actually vote in person rather than by absentee, even though I think people should have that option. But for people who are not in particularly vulnerable health risk categories, in-person voting on election day or in the several weeks of early voting that many states now have will get the numbers complete much earlier. And so I think given that we've seen some movement towards in-person voting, that should also help a bit in allowing states like North Carolina to get to fairly complete counts earlier than we might have been expecting. I haven't seen recent data on how people in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin are planning to vote, and whether there's a higher and higher percentage of people who are now moving towards voting in person in those states.
I think that that's an important point, that surprisingly, for as weak as election administration is in the United States, underfunded and so forth, the administrative component of elections has actually responded remarkably well this year. If you go back to Wisconsin in the primary, where you had basically absentee ballots going from 100,000 roughly to over 1 million in one cycle. The Wisconsin election officials, imperfectly, sure, there were some lost ballots and there were lines in Milwaukee, but basically they got everything done in a 6-day period under tremendous pressure. So there is, it seems, as you go further down the administration of elections, which tends to devolve to the county level, there seems to be a capacity to respond in many, many parts of the country that was, to my mind, unexpected. One of the worst places, by the way, for our audience is, of course, New York City. And fortunately, nothing much turns in the presidential election on the precise New York City vote. New York State is likely to go to Joe Biden. How's that for a prediction, Ben?
Hey, way out there on a limb, fella.
But New York State and New York City continue to be disaster zones in election administration, but the flexibility has been quite remarkable, and including much more capacity to vote early in person, as Rick said.
And can I just make one small point to add to flesh that out? Again, on sort of the optimistic side of the picture, remember that one of the major worries we had over the summer was, will we have enough poll workers to staff all the necessary polling locations? Because 2/3 of poll workers are 60 years or older. Many of them had not been willing to work during the primaries. Many of them had said they wouldn't work in the general election out of out of concern for their greater vulnerability to the virus. And by all accounts, most places are in very good shape about poll workers from the data I've gotten and the conversations I've had with election administrators. We think that 95% at least of the traditional polling places are going to be open in states like, I think this was Wisconsin, if I remember being told correct, if I remember correctly, what I was told about that. So these were some of the other issues we had tremendous anxiety about several months ago that look to be in better shape. And with all of this tremendous return of absentee ballots early and in-person voting early, that's also going to take a lot of pressure off the election day system and the volume of people who are showing up only on election day, which will hopefully make the administrative task go more smoothly as well.
So Fernita, Ben and Rick seem to be congenitally optimistic people by nature, and you and I are more realistic. So let me go back to scenarios of election meltdowns, because a lot of the questions we're getting from audience revolve around that. Obviously, it's much more dramatic than talking about all the great things that actually have been done to make it likely that we will have a decent election, or efforts to make it likely. But let's say that there is these self-appointed poll watchers who come out on election day. Let's say that there are challenges at the polling places. Let's say that there is a concerted effort by official polling officials from the political parties to challenge every absentee ballot. What are where does the legal remedy lie? What is available if we want to talk about disruption of the election process?
So, in terms of legal remedies, I'm actually not sure because I know that there are quite a few states that allow voters to challenge people at the polls if they believe that the person is not a legal voter. And so, because so many states permit it, it's hard to think about it in terms of legal remedies. I would say that if voters feel like they've been challenged or turned away, or they're having other problems at the poll, they should call 866-OUR-VOTE. But in terms of legal remedies, it's hard to think about what would be effective given that so many states actually permit challenges. So that's my first thing. But I did want to make two other points related to some of the comments that have been made. I do think that Ben and Rick raised interesting and rightfully so. They tell an interesting narrative about things that are actually working, right? And that we should sort of approach November with a sense of optimism. This is why I'm struggling with optimism. What if everything goes right? Right? What if we have a clear winner on election night or within a couple of days of the election? What if it's by a huge margin? We have, are we out of the woods? And if you can't say yes to that question, that's why I'm not optimistic, right? Because even if everything goes right with this election, we are not out of the woods. And I think that points to a larger flaw or failure within our system, right? That we still have to address, even if we have a clear winner of the presidential election. So that's the first thing. So the second thing is, and maybe I'll come back to this issue of poll workers because something just dawned on me. So I think we have to be careful to distinguish a challenge from intimidating voters, right? So voter intimidation is against the law in every state. And so that's different. The problem, though, is that some states don't require voters who are challenging people to have an evidentiary basis for that challenge. So how do you distinguish voter intimidation from an attempt to keep someone who is a lawful voter from voting? So the poll worker issue really does scare me, and I do think that could be a situation that could lead to violence at the polls. But generally speaking, my main point stands, right? Even if everything goes correctly, even if we have an election where we have a clear winner, I still think that there's cause for concern because for 4 years we've dealt with attacks on our institutions. We're having a great conversation about who are the institutional actors do we turn to in this circumstance in order to address some of these things. We don't quite have a clear answer for that. And I think it just points to larger systemic failures that will survive Trump. And then last point, what about his voters? What about that core group of individuals who believes the president, right? For better or worse, right? They believe him when they say that when he says that the system is rigged. They believe him that when he says that the only way that he loses is through fraud. What about those individuals, right? We're having a conversation about the president as the top of the ticket, the leader of the Republican Party, but there's a core group of supporters who will go to bat for him when he claims that the election is rigged. And that's true no matter what happens, even if everything goes correctly.
So Ben, can you pick that up? Can you, what are the mechanisms of repair that are needed, even if we survive this? And what happens if we have a substantial portion, Rick used the number 25%, who believe that it's not only rigged, but violence might be justified in that circumstance?
Well, I think the systemic problems with the system are important and worth addressing. It seems to me the core of what Franita was saying was what actually happens in the polling place. So let me start there. I mean, it is perhaps in theory a fine line between any one voter who is challenged and whether that challenge is valid and turns to intimidation. What will happen in the polling place is that if there are a large number of challenges, then as sure as we were sitting here, the army of overcaffeinated lawyers will kind of collide in those polling places. And there will be litigation pretty soon that, in fact, these are not well-founded charges. It is voter intimidation. So I think as a practical matter in a polling place, it really comes down to kind of the volume and the dynamics. You do have to remember also that Republicans believe that the fraud that may occurs in polling places that vote 90% Democrat and 10% Republican and less. And so those are not polling places where Republicans have a home court advantage. Not in the election officials, not in the judges, the local judges who would hear those in the trial courts. And so I think the election day serial challenges that you would have to take the talk of fraud into an actual election contest are going to play out very locally in places where Republicans are not likely to be successful. Polls may end up staying open later, but I think the challenges that are the root of what Vernita's saying about election day are going to be handled. And there are mechanisms in place to do that.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Because that's really, really helpful. Do you think that remains true even though this will be the first presidential election in which the RNC is not under a consent decree with respect to ballot security operations at polls that they were prohibited from engaging in for the last 3 decades? Do you think that?
Honestly, I think the lifting of the consent decree has meant that there has been an administrative centralization of something that took place in every election cycle by the presidential campaign and the state parties without the RNC. I mean, there was never an election cycle in which the Republican Party, we did not recruit poll watchers to go to every place we wanted to send them. We looked for irregularities, we looked for fraud. There are isolated incidents of that. They're all on the Heritage Foundation website, but that information does not make a case that our elections are rigged and fraudulent. So the lifting of the consent decree doesn't, I think, have much of a real world impact other than the press releases come from a different place.
Ben, can I ask you a question on that also? Because this is something that comes up in much of the commentary. The 2013 decision of the Supreme Court in Shelby County, which effectively removed Section 5 as a prohibition on manipulation of election rules, or weakened it substantially, didn't obviously cover places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, or very small parts of Michigan that are a primary concern today. But is it symbolically like the consent decree that had been entered against the RNC, I think in 1982, as something that symbolically held people in check, or do you think it has had no effect whatsoever?
I honestly, Sam, I found it the subject of endless fascinating law reviews and not much on the ground difference, really.
Meaning that neither one of these really affected behavior on the ground, either Section 5 or the consent decree.
Yeah, for the purposes that we're talking about in this election, I do think that's true. I mean, you've got, for example, a reduced number of polling places in a number of states in this election cycle. I think that's because you got pandemic issues that you have to deal with more than Section 5 getting removed 7 years ago.
Right, and the odd thing, of course, about Section 5 was it just meant that these institutions, these jurisdictions had to ask the Attorney General for permission to do that. And so all of a sudden, Bill Barr emerges as the hero of voting rights under this story. So
let me make one point also about Shelby County, since you asked. So one of the things that's so unusual about this election cycle is a lot of the issues have been how much the system should change to adapt to the conditions of the virus. And most of the litigation has been efforts to force changes to existing election codes, like absentees should be able to be received later than election day, and these kinds of issues. And Section 5, of course, only dealt with changes legislatures or other actors were making to voting practices. So in a context where a lot of the fight has been about whether they ought to make changes, Section 5 would have had no application to that whatsoever. So the only context in which Section 5 might have had application in the states that it was covered were changes like closing down certain polling places and the like. The other thing about this is I think that people who rest a lot of weight on Shelby County or on the criticism of Shelby County for this election assume that every change they don't like would have been blocked under Section 5. And that's not necessarily true either. There are, as Ben said, legitimate reasons to close down some polling places as voting patterns change because of the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. I can't judge whether the various polling changes that have been made in different places are being made for the right reasons or possibly sinister reasons. But let me also put this perspective on the issue and the worries about challenges at the polls, which I think we are concerned about given some of the rhetoric. Remember, so much of this process is happening now. In Texas, more than 40% of the volume of people who voted in 2016 have already voted. In states like North Carolina and Florida, they are processing absentee ballots. And you're not seeing these issues arise, whether it's with respect to challenges, in early voting sites or fights over the processing of absentee ballots in these states. Now, maybe it will take off after Election Day, but I'm not sure what percentage of the vote will end up being cast this year before Election Day. I think an awfully high percentage of the vote will be cast before we even get to Election Day. And so if we don't see these issues emerge in the next 2 weeks, that already means that they are going to be limited, at least, to issues that may arise on Election Day. And the last thing I'd say about this, and I hesitate to say this a little bit because I could be wrong, could turn out to be wrong, but in every election I've been involved in, this issue about challenges at the poll and intimidation at the polls has been talked about a lot in the run-up to the election. There were organizations, some of you may remember an organization called True the Vote, which was determined to put thousands of people in the polling places to police for fraud and all the anxiety around that. And I think some of this talk is actually designed to scare off voters from voting. Some of the arguments, we're going to put thousands of people in the polls to watch. I think a major effect often of that rhetoric is to actually try to discourage people from voting. And there's less of it that actually manifests itself in people really aggressively doing that at the polls. Now, I'm not saying that isn't going to happen this time. This time could be different. There are lots of reasons it might be different that we've talked about. But as I say, I think we should take some comfort in the fact that we're not seeing any of this activity, even though the process is much further underway than most people realize in a lot of important states.
And there's also a paradoxical effect to many of these efforts to keep down the vote, because there's at least anecdotal evidence from people who work in the field that it has the effect of redoubling the commitment to it. So that one of the paradoxes that social scientists have been trying to figure out is that despite all the efforts at increased obstacles to voter registration, or have to have a picture ID, or all these sorts of things, the states where that turns out to be the rule have not seen really statistically observable changes in voter participation relative to the states that don't have those rules. And part of the argument or the evidence seems to be that perhaps people then feel, aha, I'm going to make a real determined effort to vote because it is necessary. And I think that the political mobilizers play on that. But I want to pick up, Rick, you just made an excellent, interesting point that I hadn't really put together in this way before, which is that the strategy of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was don't change. We suspect that any change is ill-motivated. So you have in the technical language of the statute, you had to establish to the Department of Justice or the DC District Court that any change was not motivated by racial purpose or would have a excessive impact along racial lines. And so it was a break on change. And the push this year is to adapt institutionally to the conditions of pandemic, the conditions that we've not had since wartime, since the Spanish influenza, where there were also innovations.
Which was not Spanish, by the way, I want to point out. It came from Kansas. It started in Kansas.
We call it the Chinese influenza, just as a general matter. But yes, but those of us who are from Spanish-speaking countries are still sensitive about this. But anyway, but in those circumstances, the demand is on institutions that can be flexible. And the intervention of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Wisconsin primary election, which was also the state Supreme Court election, was basically a Section 5 style intervention. It says, we don't trust you to change the rules on the eve of the election, where much of what is happening and much of what the reasons that you and Ben are I was joking before, but sort of uncharacteristically optimistic, is because institutions have adapted well. So, Fernita, you've not been in this for a while. What's your reaction? What about Shelby County? What about institutional flexibility?
So that's really interesting. So effectively, Purcell is like a judicial Section 5.
Yeah. Purcell, you have to explain Purcell Supreme Court case that says to federal courts, don't mess with state electoral practices right before or very close to the election.
Maybe I have to revisit my hatred for that one. Okay, I have to think about that some more. So Shelby County, so I think I'm inclined to agree with Rick about how it's easy to blame things on Shelby County. I am guilty of that. Like I'm like, but for Shelby County. But I do think you have to take the long view, right? So yes, we are in the middle of a global pandemic where our institutions have to adapt, but all of this is happening against the backdrop of 7 years of no Section 5, where states have been basically reducing the infrastructure around voting and making it harder. And so I don't think we can look at what's happening this year while ignoring steps that states have taken in the last 7 years to make voting harder. So when I look at the pictures of the long lines in Georgia, I'm like, yeah, people are excited, but come on, 8 hours, 11 hours, that's a long time. And this is not something that happened because of, COVID or because of a reduction in polling places necessarily this year. This has been sort of a long-term strategy to make voting more difficult in Georgia. And it really paid dividends to some extent in 2018, where you had long lines as well. And the state has done very, very little to address that in the 2 years since. So I think that we shouldn't be complacent in saying that everything is because of Shelby County. But I do think it is partially to blame. And in fact, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund put out a report where they detailed the post-Shelby threats to voting at the state and local level. And I'm always shocked by just the sheer number of changes that have occurred since 2013. And in particular, covered jurisdictions have reduced the number of polling places 20% more than non-covered jurisdictions since 2013. And so it is part of this broader pattern that I think we have to take into consideration in thinking about how we ended up in this place. And so to the extent that commentators have argued that COVID has exacerbated weaknesses in our system, I think that's one of them, right? It's made it far worse. But to Rick's point, I do think that election administrators in particular have done an excellent job of trying to step up and adapt to the circumstances. And in many cases, you have election administrators trying to work and make voting more accessible, and they are standing contrary to secretaries of states and governors who are trying to make voting more difficult. And so I think in that situation, that's also a sign that we shouldn't view the state as like this one cohesive whole that is, setting out to try to make voting more difficult, because sometimes there are election administrators and local officials who are trying to make voting easier and have taken tremendous steps to do that.
And
So-
of course, budget decisions are made on the county and local level
Mhm.
on where they're going to, how much resources they're going to devote to elections.
Yes, which is something we all learned when we worked on campaigns, that you can speak in the abstract about the state of Ohio, but the worst administration from the perspective of the Obama campaign was the difficulties we had in Cuyahoga County. And Cuyahoga County is Cleveland, and it's I think the most heavily Democratic county in Ohio. So this is the local level. But Ben, let's take this to resuscitate the Bauer-Ginsburg proposals. I mean, much of what your bipartisan commission did was directed at the actual administration of elections. What would you think would be like the top 5 takeaways at this point of what we really need to do, or any number you want, but the top takeaways of what really should be implemented to facilitate election administration in the U.S.?
The toughest part of answering that question, Sam, is one that's rooted so deeply in our institutions that it seems like it's unmovable, which is we have 10,500 or so jurisdictions who actually have some role in administering elections. And to get consistency in terms of resources and machines and even basic competence, it's going to vary if you have 10,500 jurisdictions. Now, how you reduce the number of jurisdictions who actually administer election law is really difficult in a system of federalism like we have. But if there was one step that you could take, it would be to have more uniformity within states, not necessarily between the different states, but at least within states, to improve sort of everything else that goes on.
There's a power to do that, Ben. I mean, it's one of the things that's odd is that as soon as the election takes place, there's no impetus to change the election rules because the winners know that the election system worked well because they won. And but there is a power under the elections clause of Article 1 where Congress could say, look, here's the basic ground rules for federal elections. States, you do whatever you want in state elections, but here's the basic ground rules for federal elections. It's just like the census clause, which doesn't say to the states they can't have their own census. It just says, for purposes of taxation and reapportionment, this is going to be the census that's going to be used. And of course, at some point, the state practices conform to the federal mandate there. You could have more power through the elections clause to take control of at least the federal, some minimum baselines for the federal elections, couldn't you?
You could. It would take a whopping big Democratic majority, I think, for that to be imposed. But I mean, yes, there is a theoretical way to do it. I think if you tried to do it, Democratic senators would hear from very effectively organized for lobbying purposes groups of counties and county clerks who, I mean, do believe, as we saw in the commission, that they are best equipped to handle voting for their jurisdiction. That's a principle that may be true. The problem, again, is you got 10,500 jurisdictions, so it's not going to work. I think within the ambit of what we looked at the commission, it really was opportunities for voting, to take away barriers to voting for citizens, and that takes different forms. I mean, we were big proponents of things like online registration and for the proper maintenance of voter rolls, which if they're not cleaned up to account for moving and deaths, then you do run into everything from polling place problems to, in the age of absentee ballots, at least appearance problems in the way voting is done. We have a problem with the number of polling places that we have. Schools are the best places to generally in a community to put voting machines, but in a time of pandemic, it shows the flaws in relying on schools. So there are a number of things, but I suppose the crucially one is the equipment. I mean, our equipment upon which we vote is kind of reaching the end of its shelf life, and there are any number of jurisdictions where you just kind of hope any election, but especially this election, the machines don't break down. If there's one safeguard against massive hacking from foreign interference, it's that our election systems are so old and not connected to the internet in any systemic way that it'd be really, really tough to hack. But that's kind of small consolation.
That was actually a paradox in the Russian efforts in 2016. When they tried to penetrate the American electoral system, they found that they couldn't manipulate the vote because the machines were so chaotic and so disparate that there was no coordinated strategy. So where'd they go? They went after voter registration rolls, which under the Help America Vote Act are centralized at the state level. And those could be hacked and attacked and attempts at manipulation. So yes, having really bad systems that are completely archaic and dysfunctional.
Great safeguard.
That's a great safeguard. That's the most optimistic thing we've heard today. So, Rick, what do you think are the, I want to join with you in the sense that by and large, the response to the extraordinary circumstances has been mostly in good faith and mostly seems to have been conducted well, but you don't want to rely on ad hoc responses to these kind of chaotic circumstances. What are your takeaways here?
Well, I think that the two issues that I've been concerned about since Bush v. Gore, when I was forced, like all of us, to actually open up the black box of election administration, which we had mostly not paid attention to as scholars, and to discover how the system worked at this kind of micro level, still seem to me to be two of the biggest issues. The first is that we need more nonpartisan election administrators in the system. We elect many of the officials who oversee the voting systems in the states, including secretaries of state, most prominently. And they're often elected, in partisan elections. They often want to ascend to the next office. Actually, the Secretary of State's position is not a terrible place to start if you want to become governor of a state. I just think it's not a well-designed system to have partisan elected officials administering elections. We're one of the only countries that actually does that. Some of these secretaries of states do great jobs, by the way, I should say. But it's a peculiar American feature of our process that we have partisan elected officials, whether it's an attorney general, a secretary of state, a county canvassing board, that are often elected. I'd like to see that change. The second thing is what Ben mentioned, which is the hyper decentralization of the system. And one of the things that's interesting to mention here is that one of the effects of Bush v. Gore has actually been to press for more consistency across the states, across a state, in various aspects of election administration. And I definitely agree with Ben that a lot of our problems trace to having individual counties or units even smaller than counties that are hard to monitor, less likely to be operating at a really high level than if these things were done at the state level. And we did successfully centralize the voter registration process after 2000. So Congress, through the Help America Vote Act, required states to do the voter registration process at the state level. That was a big improvement. More improvements like that would help. I think the biggest barrier to participation is the one that's least focused on, which we have mentioned, which is the voter registration process. Because we put the burden on voters in most states to register themselves to vote. In a lot of countries, the state automatically registers people to vote when they reach voting age. Americans move so often, and you have to change your voter registration if you move, and you have to do it a certain amount of time in advance of the election in most places. And we are making significant progress on that issue, actually. That's another thing that I think is moving in a good direction. There are many states now, I don't know the exact count, that have adopted online registration as one option. There are some states that are going to have automatic voter registration, like when you go to the DMV and get your first driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote unless you choose to opt out. And, you know, I sometimes think we focus on the highest profile issues, particularly the ones that are in litigation, especially if the litigation goes to the Supreme Court, like a voter ID law out of Indiana, in the case that went to the Supreme Court on voter ID laws. And we sometimes don't see the infrastructure that actually poses a greater barrier to participation, but is much less visible. And I think number one on that list is online registration. And in addition, if states can do it as a practical matter, same day voter registration has been shown to be the reform that most enhances turnout levels. So some of these are not, you know, glamorous issues, but I think on the ground, they make a difference, and those are areas: consistency statewide, less partisan administration, and then these barriers that are less visible, like the voter registration system.
Well, Franita, you get the last word. I know you have to go teach in a few minutes, so why don't you close out for us? What's at the top of your list? What do you take away from this election cycle as showing areas that need reform or could be reformed effectively?
So I do think we have to continue the conversation, even if we get past the current moment, in a way that's productive and results in some legislative and possibly constitutional change. Maybe I'm too pie in the sky. Maybe that's my point of optimism, that we really do need to rethink how we do this. And part of the problem is that, you know, we often focus on areas that are contested, areas that are in swing states. And we look at that, and if things are going well in those areas, we assume that that applies more broadly than it actually does. It turns out that there are a lot of areas that are not contested, but part of the reason that they're not contested is because voter suppression has been effective, voter disenfranchisement has been effective. Like, for example, no one would look at Mississippi and say, wow, that's a state where it's, you know, really contested. But if Mike Espy wins the Senate race down there, he'll be the second Black senator since Reconstruction, right? That's well over 100 years, and that's crazy for a state that has a African-American population of like 30 or 35%, right? But Mississippi doesn't get a lot of attention because it's not generally a state we think of as being contested. And so, you know, I know that the presidential conversation is often driven by the swing states and what's happening there, but we do have to think more broadly and when we're advocating for systemic change. One other point I want to make, since I have the floor, I read Alexander Kazar's book on Why Do We Have the Electoral College, which really changed my thinking around a lot of this. And one thing it made me realize is that we have a conversation about the Electoral College, mostly when it fails or works, depending on how you look at it, right? But also when we have these contested elections, so we have the conversation then, but every decade or two, we have a conversation about changing the Electoral College as well. Like throughout history, there have been these continuous conversations about changing the Electoral College, but nothing happens, right? It's not until we really reach a point of true crisis that something happens. And 1876 was almost that moment, right? Because in March, we almost had dueling inaugurations, right? Where two people were going to show up and try to claim the presidency. And then in 1880 and 1884, we had really, really close elections. And as a result of that, we got the 1887 Electoral Count Act that nobody understands and few people want to read, right? But my point is that we finally got some change, but it came at the cost of almost being, you know, the country, right? We were at the brink of another civil war over an election. And so my worry, my top line concern is that it will have to come to something like that again for us to see the type of change that we need. It's not enough to have a conversation. No offense, Ben, it's not enough to have a commission either. We need more than just, you know, talk. We have to have some movement around these issues, even if we get past November. But so often when we have success, then the conversation stops. And I'm just worried that that'll happen again.
Well, you invoke 1876, and that's near and dear to NYU because Samuel Tilden was one of the first graduates of NYU Law School. And if life ever resumes as normal, you can still see his desk sitting prominently in Trevor Morrison's office. our dean's office. So on that, we will have to resume this. We have another round scheduled after the election, and we'll see whether the optimists or the pessimists have the better hold on American reality. Thank you again, Fernita. It was great. I know you have to run to teach. Ben, it's always a pleasure to have you at NYU. Thank you again for coming. And Rick, you and I live here, so we're here. Thank you all very much.